And I'm delighted to introduce the panel that will reflect on the proposition for today, whether we are experiencing a winter or whether this is actually the signs of an early kind of spring or a new wave. And we have four distinguished panelists that will represent the private sector, because as you all know, at GovLab, we believe that open data is not just about open government data, but also about providing access to private sector data, but also leveraging expertise within the private sector in order to democratize access to data as well. And so we have four distinguished panelists. Michael Chalve, and if it would be feasible for the panelists to switch on their video, that would be great as well. And Michael is the Chief AI Architect and Director of Innovation at the Tech for Social Impact initiative at Microsoft Philanthropies and has years of experience in the data and AI space. And delighted to have you here, Michael. Then we have Chris Diegelmeijer, or Degelmeijer, sorry for the pronunciation, who is the global head of social impact at Splunk and has been working on the topics of providing access to data and bridging the digital divide for a long time. And then we have Amra Dorch-Bayar, who is the co-founder and CEO of a new startup called Wobby.ai. And delighted to have you here, Amra, because you're kind of our poster child on how new startups can actually also be used for providing access to data in a more conversational manner. And then delighted to also have Francisco Silero, who is the global head of data solutions at Telefonica. And Telefonica, of course, has been a key leader in the data for good space as well. So delighted to have you here as well. So let me stop sharing the slide deck so that we actually can have a conversation. And let me start with Chris, if that's okay. You've been, as I mentioned in my brief introductory remarks, you've been a leader in the space as it relates to bridging the data divide for quite a while. And your work at Splunk has been truly inspirational in how you have supported initiatives towards that end. So eager to get from you, Chris, kind of a first reactions to the proposition of today, right? Are we going in the right direction or should we be worried? And then specifically also thinking about what's the role of the private sector in actually bridging the data divide and making sure that the current state of the data divide is actually moving into a better state than we might currently in, depending on your assessment of the current state, of course, as well. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for hosting this event. It's really important, and always thanks for your leadership. Stefan and I met many years ago when nobody was talking about data up in Wasson Island in Canada and the role of philanthropy. And I would say my view on the trends around open data are a bit mixed. And I think on one hand, we have these great stories and examples that are bespoke, whether that be in Paraguay or, around the world from the US. But if we take this step back, that the ecosystem is not looking good. And as you kind of alluded to, I want to go a little bit deeper on both of those. To get to open data, one is you need a data foundation in the impact space, and that's civil society and government. So I think we want to continue to focus on that. And then I think the other challenge, because you've got to define the challenge to figure out the solution, data is a new form of power. And any time you have a form of power, it doesn't necessarily lead to good behavior. So let me unpack those a little bit. And on the foundation side, you've had many conversations about it, but I think it's important to think about what is your starting place, right? So if I wake up one day and I'm going to run a marathon, How fast I'm going to get there is depending on my starting place. Have I never ran before, or have I been doing half marathons for, 5 years? And I think even if we just take a glance globally at government data, civil society data, that starting place is somewhere around, I've maybe been walking a mile or two relative to the private sector. And therefore, as we continue to advocate for open data, we have to equally continue on that path to make data, it's got to be structured, it's in siloed. And so building up that kind of, capacity around government. And I'll get to, a way I think we, want to approach that from a field building standpoint. And then secondly, on that power, which you alluded to, is private companies are retracting. We're going to need to address both. I am more optimistic of solving the government and civil society data problem right now than I am in getting the private sector to continue with open access, because on a myriad of levels, it's not what the market incentivizes. And so I'm glad we're raising it. And I'll just say, I don't necessarily have a solution on that one yet as we move to regulation. And then your second comment on what is the role of the private sector. I'd say it falls into kind of three categories. One is, I'm sure Microsoft and all of us here in Telefonica is leveraging all of our assets to drive the social change. And for Splunk, as you said, we are fanatical about bridging this data divide. And we do that in three ways: field building, raising the awareness, and pushing the boundary for everybody to be more data forward. Supporting organizations through product donation and charitable giving and moving data to action, and then also building the skills and workforce development in the field. And I think those are critical elements that we all play a role. I think where it gets harder, but is this new phase to not get to the data winner, but to have a glimmer of hope in the spring, is also starting to be more advocates of the role of the private sector, keeping their data open and accessible. And then taking that voice and that advocacy also to the government sector. So as we're solving for that data foundation in governments and in civil society and NGOs, we also need to start bringing that voice to the private sector as they're retracting on open data and keeping that. And ensuring that we're also, thinking of the market incentives. And so how can we think differently on open data incentives across government and the private sector to move that needle? And I think that is a challenge that, is on all of our table that we need to figure out, is changing the incentives for the private sector to ensure that they're moving the needle on open access, as well as with government and as well as with civil society. And so just, I'll say kind of my closing comment of challenging space, data is the new power. I think one opportunity we all have, and this is really on the philanthropic side, it's on the investment side, is we need to start thinking of data as organizational effectiveness, and to think of it as similar to how we think of, we would never invest in an organization that didn't have financials, right? Every government has a budget, they monitor their financials. It's the same thing for civil society, because that's organizational effectiveness. Financial acumen is foundational to just, existing today in the world. And therefore, we need to move from data as a project to data always. And so to me, that is one approach that if we can move the mindset and the behavior of investors, individuals, philanthropists to not think of data as a project, but to data always and investing in it like we do fundamental financial systems in all organizations. We can build that data foundation and then continue to tackle with the access piece, but ensuring that we have, credible, valuable data for social and environmental challenges, like we do for the private sector around efficiency and, business intelligence.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chris. And wonderful overview. I mean, you addressed all my follow-up questions already, but I think I do want to pick up on, and we'll get back to you, Chris, later as well, but pick out the kind of the incentive question, and well, both the incentive question and the maturity question, which I think is indeed fundamental, right? So we cannot even start thinking about unlocking data if the data maturity is not kind of up to speed. And so let me go straight to perhaps Francisco and build upon what the foundation here that Chris has laid out. And I think I will ask everyone to also reflect on what Chris laid out later on. But clearly, what's the incentive for private sector, for people that have a certain, or organizations that have a certain level of maturity to also contribute to society by making either the data available or helping others become data always, which I like, Chris, as kind of the new paradigm to think about data as well. So, Francisco, so what's from a Telefonica perspective? I mean, of course, Telefonica has done a lot of work in data for good, is now part of the industry Data for Society partnership that was created by Microsoft and others as well. So what's the incentive from your perspective for the private sector to also be a responsible actor like you are in the open data movement?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the event. So let me share with you a little bit our perspective. So we've been working on data for more than 10 years ago for Data for Goods initiative. So first through research, directly teaming with multiple universities and researchers across the globe. And then with the POCs, where together with governments, multilateral organizations, supporting relevant social challenges like bird flu, swine flu, natural disaster impact and population. And now we're more focused on creating active impact, collaborating with organizations focused on sustainable ecosystems, like, for instance, IDSP, among others, to enable the collaboration with multiple key stakeholders, joining multiple data sets and enabling more complex analytical solutions. So like Chris mentioned before, we also believe that a collaborative work is definitely much more important and will have much more impact than just individual project sprints. Okay, so some of the contemporary social challenges like climate change, smart city planning, territorial cohesion, decentralization, or some types of social and economics indicators will definitely benefit much more if we change this behavior. Okay, so for Telefonica, Telefonica Tech leads digital transformation for companies, for our customers, our B2B customers, to help business become more efficient, especially on when we consider AI and data solutions, which is one of our business lines, the one that in fact enables the data collaboration that we have. So soon we realized that the data, the unique value of the telco networks data could be used and transformed into population mobility, and that could help us generate insights used in both commercial use cases and also in our data special projects. So in fact, both things for us go together. And also, and this is maybe potentialized with the current AI increase, or the exponential use of the AI, and which we believe is a little bit of the rainy days within the spring. So we do believe it's going to be spring, but we will have some rainy days. But definitely what we see is a focus on data governance. So maybe some of the things that we advocate in the past, they were not so prioritized because data governance was seen as a more bureaucratic process. And now with the intensive use of data for AI models, and also the power and the potential of those models, now the quality of the input, the quality of the data then became a priority. So data governance models might be a little bit what I mean as the rainy days, because they require some time to be deployed, to be implemented, to ensure that the quality of the data will serve as input for good outputs when using the AI models. And just by finalizing, sorry, on your first question. So in terms of how companies can be encouraged in order to share and in order to improve. So in our perspective, so we believe the first point is data alone. So data itself is power, again, like Chris mentioned, and that power first goes to the business that we are on. And so the quality of the data, the good care of that data, good governance, good analytics, those are key and factors for good quality insights. So that's the first point, and that is very important for us. And then the second one is the external use and how it can bring orthogonality to the existing data sets. Okay, so this value can be externally capitalized, okay, and it can be capitalized on the B2B side, of course, supporting other businesses developing their own activities, but also, of course, on data for social good, which definitely we all want to participate and we all want to be part of it.
Thanks so much, Francisco. And again, numerous topics that anyway we could deconstruct. But I think it's super interesting to hear that first of all, anyway, that AI has actually, and that's something perhaps to already prepare the stage for Michael and Amra as well. But that I think AI has definitely put data quality front and center, right? And I think the question that we also sought to answer in our report with regard to open data and generative AI is actually open data even ready for the generative AI space? And I think that's where there's a lot to be learned from what's happening in the private sector, where there's also a growing realization that actually it's great to have a lot of data. It's better to have a lot of quality data, especially if we are moving into kind of an AI environment. But also, I think, and again, that's kind of a follow-up question, Francisco. Yeah, is making data accessible also not a great opportunity to actually learn what is the quality of your data? Because I think, and then that could actually be an incentive from my point of view for many data holders. At the same time, a scary incentive perhaps, because then anyway, they might actually realize that the quality of their data needs improvement. But at the same time, is that not also kind of an incentive to really, what some might call kind of one of the incentive is kind of cheap R&D for corporations with regard to their data, because if they make it open, then actually others can actually do R&D on your data, and you actually can extract then the insights internally as well, and that might actually be kind of an incentive. So wonder, Francisco, whether that resonates, that kind of incentive of R&D, outsourced R&D that you can bring back into the corporation, but then also you can actually know what is the level of quality of your own data by making it open. And then
Yes,
go to Michael on the AI questions. Yes, sorry.
Definitely. So again, in our case, so we started by network events, okay, which are generated and needed for a specific type of activity, which are the telecommunication services, okay. So then we start using that data internally because we understood it helped us improve our business, our traditional, our core business. Okay, so we had use cases, internal use cases for it. Then we saw and understood some, especially around population mobility and describing general population mobility, that those insights could be helpful for other organizations, private and public. So yes, there is a key point. The key point are the use cases. So we think about the ones we detect within our day-to-day activities. Okay, so that's why I mentioned previously it is very important to work with this data in controlled or managed ecosystems where you can have people, other researchers, other people looking into different types of use cases. So for sure, there will be more use cases, more good uses for this data that we are not aware. And that can only be possible when sharing and providing access to other participants, and especially participants that are usually on our day-to-day type of activity. So again, that's why I believe it's very important having these controlled ecosystems to share data to ensure the good use, of course, of the good intentions of the data, but that's an acceleration factor, okay? That's where the new capabilities, the new uses for that data, and where which other situations that data can add value. And related to the second part of the question, so in terms of quality, yes, for sure. So in our case, we have an internal team dedicated, so we did that investment, so we are continuously improving and developing around the quality of the insights we generate. But again, it depends on the use case. Sometimes we have different perspectives, different angles looking into the data that provide you awareness or provide you some misinterpretation that on your day-to-day you are not aware of them. So again, the end use will benefit us to have a wider perspective on how that data can be used and how the variability around that data can add information value to other situations.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, Francisco. So let's go to Michael, and so we already touched on kind of the data divide, then the role of the private sector, and of course AI is kind of the anyway one of the drivers that puts open data kind of in different perspective, right? And so eager to hear from you, Michael, who has worked on this for many years now. First question, what's different, right? And then the second question related to that might be, so what does it mean in terms of open data? But also, I think also building to what Chris was referring to, what does it mean for kind of the social sector, right? As well, because that's kind of an area that you have focused on as well. So two small questions. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for driving forward this important discussion across the community here. So there's no doubt that modern AI, large language models, generative AI have really changed the game. It feels like the world at large has all of a sudden discovered AI. Everybody's sort of finding ways to use AI, both in their personal lives and professional lives. And we've also really seen how modern AI can now sort of democratize access to AI capabilities in a way that they've been unable to do before. So their ability to allow users to engage with models without needing any kind of instruction, any guidance, and find value in it from the get-go. And so this is true for English and a few other languages. However, when you look at the availability of large language models more broadly, it's clear that that the quality of what they can do quickly drops off as you go just a little bit further down the list of languages. And so that means that the value that we're experiencing in English and a few other languages is simply not accessible to the large majority of the world population. So I believe that the biggest challenge today, biggest remaining challenges is around language access, improving support for many, many more languages. And of course, there's a good reason for that. The key reason is around market pressure from the private sector. It's more commercially viable to invest in developing generative AI models support for, say, the first 10 languages that it is, for example, the next 200 languages, any of those next 200 languages. So I think from the tech sector, getting this prioritized, it often needs to be driven by philanthropic principles rather than commercial interests. And it is encouraging to see more and more of these types of initiatives and investments happening across the sector. But of course, much more is needed. And I do think that the open data community can be a powerful ally and collaborator in making this happen, seeing that one of the key costs around making generative AI large language models available for more languages is the data itself. The challenge often is that there isn't enough data in those target languages. And so engaging very explicitly directly with the open data community, make sure that the right tools are available in infrastructure, I think that that can get us very far in those objectives.
Great. And so interesting, very interesting to indeed also reflect on, and it goes back to, I think, what Chris was starting with was kind of the power asymmetries, but now we have new kind of asymmetries, which is also kind of asymmetries based upon kind of access to different data from different languages, right? Mm-hmm. And so it gets even more complicated and more kind of challenging from an inclusivity and equity perspective. So one approach, of course, that has been suggested is the creation of those kinds of data commons, right? So it's kind of, and again, data commons is not a new approach, but it's kind of becoming kind of reimagined as a result of seeking access to data for instance, distinctive type of data, such as data from different languages as well. Mm-hmm. So what's your sense on how data commons is going to become kind of an important open data approach? And again, just to warn Amra, is that I might ask you similar kind of questions with regard to kind of your approach of a marketplace of data, which I know you might refer to as well. But then the second related question to that, very briefly, and then Chris, you feel free to chime in as well on this. But so we have language data from different languages, but actually it's interesting that we also have kind of new kind of distinctive data that is very relevant for instance, fine-tuning of models. And so the whole question has been, do we actually need a new kind of open data that is specifically data for actually supporting the creation of large language models that are less, that are more inclusive, right? And that are less kind of guarded by just a few players. And so that's kind of another question in the open data space, I think, that is worth considering. Over to you, Michael, very briefly, and then I go to Amra, who has been very patiently waiting for his turn. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Data commons will be a key driver and facilitator of much of this work, and making the value, the impact of modern AI much more broadly available. Digital public goods, digital public infrastructure as well. I think is something we need to lean into as a community. The open data community is a vibrant community with passionate participants, and combined with tools and infrastructure along compute power from the tech sector, and as well as obviously making private sector data sets that have potential to be much more broadly usable, making all that accessible to the open data community is needed. And I think we can collectively make significant progress on addressing these challenges, so each bringing their own expertise to the table. You touch a little bit about inclusivity. I think one of the key aspects in doing these, doing this ethically is around data selection. So getting data from underserved languages is important. It's absolutely needed. But even for the languages where you have the luxury of selecting data, it is important to be explicit about what data use as opposed to just take all the data and learn from whatever is in there. So understanding the process of data selection, understanding how you can proactively seek potential for bias and counter that bias in how you select data and train the models. I think that's important in making sure that the resulting AI models are more balanced in representing particular marginalized communities, so that they represent the broader user base.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. And yeah, please feel free to add to the Q&A. I will come back to the Q&A, don't worry, in a second. And also, if some of the participants here wants to answer to some of the questions in the Q&A box, feel free to go ahead as well. But over to you, Amra. And again, thanks for your patience to be the last on the list here. But your work, of course, has been very inspirational at the level of making open data more conversational, and especially for particular kind of groups such as journalists, for instance, right? Where anyway, data journalists are a critical user of open data, but in the past had this massive burden of actually preparing the data sets, making sense of the data sets, and so on. And so your work on using generative AI and other tools to actually lower the barrier for accessing open data, I think is super interesting. And so eager to hear from you, Amra. Anyway, what was the rationale? Why now, right? So is actually generative AI kind of the trigger and the game changer, as Michael said, that actually might provide that spring of hope despite the rainy days that Francesco has warned us from. So yeah, so what's, from your perspective, the kind of, are we entering a new wave? Question mark.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here because Wobby is really the new kid on the block. So it's really an honor to be able to contribute to this discussion at this early stage of our startup. My motivation to build Wobby was really born out of my experience as a data journalist. What you need to know is journalism is a field where accurate information is needed very fast, but also where the technical skills and the know-how are very low. So in the past, open data in most cases were only used in news stories when someone already did the work and provided kind of the ready-made data insights to the journalist, or if they could simply find it on some government website. So for professionals like journalists, open data was never really open in the truest sense of the word, because true openness should also encompass both the technical accessibility, but also the ease of use. So in my experience, most open data sets are only open in the theoretical and technical sense. Yes, you could access it, but you need a lot of technical know-how to be able to use them properly. That's why I felt that there must be a better way. And when ChatGPT first came out and the subsequent generative AI revolution we now see today, I saw an opportunity to truly democratize open data for non-technical professionals like journalists, and that's how Wobby was born. But while building Wobby, we came across a whole range of issues. For example, there is not really a single point of access for all kinds of open data. They're scattered all around the internet, on all types of government websites. And another very important problem that we face is that there is a lack of kind of a unified standard for metadata, meaning the data about the data. And some government websites have an API endpoints and some don't. And most of open data are simply some Excel or PDF files uploaded on a website. But many of these issues can be solved, and we start to see some very positive trends in that regard. For example, the European Commission has given a directive to all their member states to publish high-value data in a machine-readable way. And we also see some other possibilities, and some of the challenges can actually be solved by using the power of generative AI. But I think the biggest threats and risks are more related to the rising tendency of what I would call data protectionism, where we see an alarming trend of data protectionism, mostly from the private companies like Twitter, Meta, Reddit. They are limiting their access to their APIs, and tools like CrowdTangle that a lot of journalists and researchers used to use have been stopped. And this trend really undermines the openness of the open data. And on the other hand, we also see that global conflicts have an effect on the trust in data. For example, many of our customers, when they ask us about the quality of the data, they want to know where they come from, and if it's from a Russian government website, that's already seen kind of like, oh, we will not trust that. So there could be, through the global conflict, some kind of a divide in the trust in data and in how we share data as well. So this is the type of threats and risks that I see as well in this space.
Great, thanks so much, Amra, and super interesting to also take on board the kind of geopolitical ecosystem that we are in. Plus, of course, this information as being anyway kind of fundamental behind the toxic data and information kind of ecosystem that we are currently in as well. So can you give us one key kind of use case to get a sense on how generative AI is being used, for instance, for data journalism or for others as well? Because I think it's interesting is that you started off with data journalism, but then it turns out there are all kinds of other users that came out of the woodwork to have access to data as well. So eager to hear how that, anyway, so who are actually the kind of the use base for open data? And then based upon that, I quickly want to go back to Chris after that to also, perhaps you can start reflecting on it as well, to think about, so Amra was referring to high value data sets that, of course, the European Union has made aware. And of course, we can hold discussion whether these are the right high value data sets or whether there should be other high value data sets. But I think the interesting part, at least, is that there is a kind of an assumption that there are certain data that needs to be prioritized with regard to access to data. And so question to you, Chris, as a follow-up, once Amra has given the response first, is should we actually have high value data sets? And the same also for you, Michael, perhaps, is in the social sector, right? So should we actually, because you mentioned kind of organizational efficiency, but there are other certain kind of data sets that for the social sector should be seen as kind of high value data sets that the philanthropic community perhaps should actually support or prioritize. But over to you, Amra. With regard to the first question, the use base and kind of use cases. And then I will go through the list of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. As you mentioned, yes, the use case really started from journalism, but we see a lot of other use cases for the private sector. And right now, we see customers like people in the policy making, trade associations, all kinds of lobby groups. We see that they also need data, and in general, it's been really interesting to see what actually convinces them. It's both from we try to convince the government to publish more data, and we try to convince customers to use more public data. And in the past, I've been always advocating to statistical bureaus and governments to publish more open data, in sense of that would increase better journalism, that would increase democracy and that type of values. But nowadays we can pretty much say actually open data improves the economy, because a lot of private companies can actually use open data either to create new types of product, but also to have some competitive advantage by understanding what's happening in the world. Because using data, the biggest use case is to make sense of what's happening in the world, and that's also the type of arguments that we can give to our customers and private companies, to make them aware of the value of open data.
Great. Thanks so much, Amra. And yes, I mean, that's quite often, I mean, so also the argument for governments who care about economic well-being of their society to actually also care about open data, right? So because quite often in the past, of course, it was about open data as a tool for accountability, right? Because it came quite often out of this kind of freedom of information movement. But I think indeed, having access to data also provides for innovation and for economic growth in some cases as well. And that's something that, Francisco, I want to also get your reaction to what extent is Telefonica a user of open data as well? Would be interesting to see. Anyway, so is this kind of a reciprocity kind of environment? But Chris and Michael, do you quickly want to reflect on kind of, should we actually start prioritizing certain data sets also in the social sector and actually then support that as making it available?
So
Chris, yes.
yeah, I'll jump in there, and I just want to, before answering that specific question, I also think to rely on philanthropy is not a recipe for success. And so when we think of open data and where, and again, that's what I think we're really good at, is these philanthropy projects. Oh, the private company is going to give their data for 2 or 3 years, and then the nonprofit and so forth. And then the private sector goes away and the project, ends. And the fact is, philanthropy does not have a track record of sustained long-term commitment to meet the needs of kind of, open data at scale. So I think we need to really look at, we've got to figure out a government incentive system where they can be more the long-term host, whether it's health or transportation. They're spending a lot of money on services, and can we make the argument of being more data forward is going to help them provide better services at a more efficient cost? And philanthropy still will have a role to play. It is just not a long term. We just need to acknowledge that, the flakiness of short-term piece that comes with that, and that's in family philanthropy, private philanthropy, and unfortunately corporate philanthropy. CEOs change. There are things we can't control, and so then to answer your question on should we prioritize certain open data, yeah, I think in different situations, yes. I think at one level, a lot of the open is local, right? So if you're trying to solve problems, it is a local it's your transportation, it's your health, it's your housing, so there's a lot to kind of be done at that city level, but it really needs to be thought about because that's the impact of the people. Then there are a few global challenges, and really climate change is the biggest one, and or I would say sometimes, broad health impacts fall into that category, that I think you could work with the experts in the areas to really think about where are we going to get the best return on investment. We got some really good climate scientists all over the world that I think could answer that question. So I think you have to look at it really at a local level, and then there's a fewer number of areas where I think it's at a global level.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Michael, very quickly, your perspective on that, and then Francisco, and then I go through the list of questions that we have, because we have quite an active audience here. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, just one comment coming back to the high value data sets. I think that's a good approach. Obviously, one question is valuable to whom. It's one data set may be of critical value to one specific initiative, but absolutely zero value to most others. So there's obviously a need of diversity of data sets, along with, for example, metadata or commentary from the data creators of what they believe that this data set is appropriate to use for. Obviously, that's not limiting, can be used for other things if people find value in that, but at least sort of a guidance on, here's the data set, and we believe this provide value in this specific area. We have used this, and we have evidence to show that this can be used for this, and want to make it available to the broader community. So the high value data sets, I think it's interesting to look at the EU's process for selecting. Yeah, I think it's a good approach, as long as there is diversity in data sets that are made available.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And as you know, I've been arguing is that, anyway, we have high value data, but we also have value questions. And perhaps we should focus on the high value questions to then understand exactly, Chris, what's the high value question at the local level and the high value question. And then we will understand the diversity of data that we might need, right? But I think we probably need both. So Francisco, very quickly, so Amra said it's like, anyway, open data, and in this case, open government data is actually also, anyway, a source for corporations to actually leverage. And so eager to hear, anyway, Telefonica, of course, has a big experience in their data for good, but also, anyway, how does it operate from accessing open government data for Telefonica, for instance, and do you see the value of that?
Thank you, Stefan. So definitely we do use open data, open government data, or also some open private data. So again, definitely combining multiple data sources is a good recipe for the use case, the different use cases that you can be working on. So for instance, I can give you an example. So for the census, country census, and some of the updates around the behaviors specifically on the census. So we do use them. They do help us understand the overall population behaviors. So we do analyze them, okay, and we also use them to help us do the extrapolations. And then also happens on the other side. So in several countries, we work with the National Statistics Office, which are also trying to improve, to change to new data sets, who want to move from just the surveys to new, more up-to-date or near real-time data sets. So we also develop specific indicators, KPIs, that represent the way they look into the population, into the behaviors, either from a mobility perspective or even a tourism perspective, okay, so that they can start adopting them and complement the way they generate their statistics and their indicators.
Great, thanks. And the next panel will also reflect on that, I guess, because we have Federico from the Statistical Office of Uruguay, who also will potentially reflect on that as well. So let's go to the Q&A. We have like 15 minutes, or anyway, my team probably will freak out that I take more time than necessary again. I think 40 minutes, and we have a lot of questions. And so why don't I go from kind of the top, because they have been most patient to wait. And so, and some of them might be, anyway, already have been answered to a large extent as well. But the first one is, of course, anyway, the perennial question of capacity and how do you train people and what are the kind of ways to go. But I will combine a few training as well, which then goes back to, I guess, the similar to what Jennifer was saying. It was just like, how do you get actually maturity in organizations. And so why don't we take those two questions, which is basically a capacity question, right? So how do you build capacity, and is training the way forward as well? So who wants to address, I think some of them were addressed to Chris, but anyone wants to reflect on, and also Amra, the question to you perhaps as well, right, is that you mentioned the capacity of journalists needs to be improved. So how do you go about, Chris, why don't you start, because I see you have switched off your thing. Why don't we start with you, Chris, and then Amra, you might want to reflect on that as well.
Yeah, so I'll say on the training side, the good news with a lot of companies, we offer a lot of free training. So I'd say that's definitely an upside. And even though with that challenge, though, that's going to be kind of baseline training, right? I think then to answer the capacity challenge at an organization and a government level, we have to look at shared services.
Right.
So we've got to really we cannot solve this at an organization by organization level. And that's where we get back to these data commons and shared service organizations that you can work with the data scientists for a period of time to set something up. And we have a few examples of those here in the United States. Project Evident is one of them, and it's doing phenomenal work, but we need hundreds of them. And I'd say it's a bit of a frustration that we're still trying to look at this at an organization level, and we'll never be able to, the impact sector will never be able to compete with the private sector. And so we need to move to the shared service model.
Great. Amra?
Yeah, the whole point of why we built Wobby in the first place is to kind of avoid a situation where journalists need a lot of training. In my experience, in my case, I did about 2 years of self-study of how to analyze data using Python and coding, and now we kind of lowered that training time to about 1 hour. A journalist needs about 1 hour of workshop to learn how to use Wobby, and to make it really as easy as having a conversation. And we see a lot of progress in there. Journalists are using our platform to analyze data in a much simpler way. But at the same time, aside from the training, what I also realized after the fact is that not only is it the training, but we also need to do a lot of change management, meaning that journalists have never been the type of people who would actively search for data. Oftentimes, when it comes to fast news, they would just kind of get it in a press release or something like that. So now to actually have to search for this type of data, there really needs to be kind of a culture change within the news organizations and all types of organizations themselves.
Great. Thanks, Amra. Few questions with regard to kind of concerns in the community about the potential extractive nature of generative AI. And so, and then anyway, so Kate is referring to kind of the Creative Commons license that anyway, it was never intended to be used in the kind of the environment where large language models anyway are kind of taking that data for training without perhaps attribution, although anyway, there's a lot of work in that space as well. And so anyone who wants to volunteer on reflecting on well, one question is, do we need a new kind of licensing regime? That's kind of one question, right? And as you know, anyway, we've been working on this notion of actually we need a social license, right? Not just a license at the kind of the data level, but really on what society actually wants the data to be used for. Yeah, so anyone wants to reflect on that? No one wants to reflect on that. So I need to then call upon Michael to reflect on that.
Yes, happy to. So, yes, I think a lot of the way that publicly accessible data has been used for training has been made available and possible in part in the absence of clear guidelines and regulation around this. And I know that is actively happening. It's an active space. Obviously, technology moves fast, AI even more so, whereas regulation by design is moving slowly. So things are happening in this space. They're offering clear and clearer guidelines about what could and should be done. I think the EU's AI Act is a really good step in the right direction, but there's clearly more needed there. The attribution side of it, I think there is a lot of open questions there, but I think it's an important discussion to have. And I suspect that discussion will even will sort of grow over the next 6 months and beyond.
Great, cool. And then there's a category of questions, I hope I'm moderating well here, that are really focused on kind of more technical, like, anyway, how do you actually use generative AI for preparing data, for making data more accessible, and are there some kind of approaches like data lakes and so on that needs to be advanced? And so perhaps Francisco, if I can ask you to reflect on and again, that was also related, I guess, to what Amra was referring to, is that actually generative AI can take out the pain of some of the existing technical laborious work on preparing data or on making even kind of the need for describing data. What Amra was saying too is like, how do we use generative AI for perhaps creating data statements, data metadata, and so on. So what's your sense on the potential here for lowering some of the barriers as such?
Let me share just a couple of thoughts regarding that subject. So, first of all, when we talk about unstructured data, so definitely with AI we'll be able to analyze and build models much more efficient than we can do traditionally, and that applies also to structured data and especially with the reality of the data. So data is not perfect. We don't have we don't get a 24 hours, 7 days a week of perfect data representing exactly what we wanted. And the data sources, the data feeds behind, they also have their issues, their problems. So either additional noise or data gaps are present on the data sets. Okay, so those problems are very complex to solve in an efficient way, and we do believe that AI will help us also analyze and improve the way the way we behave with imperfect data, and data is imperfect. Okay, but so again, using AI itself upon the data that we have, we do believe that can help us improve the models and the quality of the analytics we use on them.
Great.
Can
Michael,
I just add a point to this here, and sort of just coming back to the capacity question as well? I think for data collaboratives to be successful, for the open data community to get the most out of existing data and newly created data, it needs to be easier and cheaper to share the data and to consume data that has been shared. So I think for organizations that don't have the capacity today, having the appropriate kind of tooling to make data easier to consume will go a long way. Generative AI certainly has a role to play here, but often it's much more simpler tools that is needed for that. So I think making that transition easier once you have data, because there is a cost to make a data set available if you want to continue to maintain it, but making it easier to share, making it easier to consume, I think we need tools for that. Generative AI has some role to play, but simpler tools will go a long way.
great. Cool. Well, I think a lot of the other questions have been answered as well, and some of them might be also relevant for the following panel. I mean, we did answer the whole question about high-value data sets and priority areas as well. So let me go to the last question for all of you, which is really kind of the magic wand kind of question, which is kind of a question that is always I hate to get that question, which is why I formulate the question to others. So what would put it otherwise is that what would be kind of your wish list? And also let's think about, we have another panel from public policy makers following this panel. So what would be kind of your wish list or recommendation that you would like to see prioritized, and said, look, if we only would do this, then we would prevent the winter and really have an umbrella for the rain that Francisco is referring to, and subsequently enter in kind of a more spring-like environment. So Chris, easy question for you to get started.
Well, initially you said I could have a magic wand.
Yeah, well, you can have the magic wand.
Okay, because if I had my magic wand,
yes,
I would actually go back 30 years and put in place real data privacy. That I think would have changed the trajectory that we're on right now. And it would be global, like, yeah, so I'm in the magic wand stage. I'm going to let everybody else solve the challenge that we're in now. That I think if people actually had control and owned their data, we would just be in a different, we would be getting to AI, we would be getting to all this, but we would be in a different level of trust and ownership that would lead to better social and environmental outcomes right now. So that would be my magic wand. But so
you would go back in time. So no,
I'd go back in time
and
put in place something that I think has been the Achilles heel of where we are.
Right. Interesting. Thanks, Chris. Francisco.
Very good question. So like I said, I think right now the key concern, and not that it hasn't been pinpointed in the past, but because the intensive use of data now, especially with the AI models, bring it up to surface, is a data governance model. So I don't know if I want to go back in time and so that corporations and governments could put it in place sooner. Okay, so we will be in a different situation now, or if we just accelerate time in order to make those capacities and deploy those abilities and put it in place, so that we do understand the quality and the process, the end-to-end process of our data, so we can use it properly, either internally and of course then externally, so we can share it. We need to understand it, so we'll be able to explain it, to share it, and considering the objective and what we are talking about open data sources. It is very important to have metadata, to have a common understanding of similar KPIs, of similar content, so that they can be used properly and accordingly at a global scale.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Michael.
Yeah, if you're thinking about magic wand, for me, it's clear. It would be to have comparable quality of large language models across all languages, so that the benefits of modern AI are more equitably distributed across the world. And I think what gets us there is easier access to data, more relevant data, the right kinds of data, right amounts of data across many different sort of dimensions and segments of the world population. So yeah, comparable quality of modern AI.
Great. Amra?
Yeah, for me, it would be some kind of a single point of access to all kinds of open data in a type of data commons, or what I would call a open data marketplace, which seems to me a very logical step to improve the accessibility and usability and interoperability of these open data. And it could be a place where these providers can exchange data in kind of a semantically interconnected way that would have the benefit of that you can actually use different data sets in different languages, and they would be interoperable with each other, and in a way, in a sustainable way, where there is an incentive for small players to share the data, that they can get some benefits from it, and where big exploiters, large corporations who use the data kind of contribute to the larger ecosystem. So that would be
Great.
my wish list.
All right. Well, thanks so much for adding your preferences and magic wand use cases. Some would go back in time, some are more kind of what we need now, and some are more about on the kind of the infrastructure and equity kind of environment. Super interesting. And so I have a good news, because the next panel will provide all the solutions to what you've suggested. So over to you, Adrian. But before I go there, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Michael, Francisco, and Amra for sharing your wisdom and also for your leadership in the space. Always great to reflect on where we are and where we need to go and how we get there. Thanks so much.